I'm proud to announce that today's video is sponsored by Babbel, which happens to be the #1 language learning app in the world. Learning about history, which is why a lot of you are here, is accentuated by travel. And if you want to travel like a pro, then learning a new language is a must. But there's dozens of other reasons to do it. For example, you may need to do this for a class, for your job/professional career, or if you're into that whole self-improvement thing. Perhaps you're the type of person that likes to maximize what you can do with your free time. Or if you're like me and have a significant other who speaks another language and you want to help teach your children to be bilingual or even trilingual, then Babbel is the app you need. It's a very versatile platform. You can either learn on your computer or take the courses mobile with you on your phone. Babbel is all about learning. It's created by people with real-world experiences with real-world phrases. What's more, and this is my favorite, there are no ads, so you can focus on picking up a new language. I've provided for you a link in the description below. If you click on it now, you can get a whopping 50% off for 6 months. So hit that link, start your journey with Babbel, and begin picking up a new language today. And now for the video you've been waiting for. In the year 1230, Al-Andalus was in a dire situation. By this point in history, she was a far cry from the time of the formidable Umayyad Caliphate that once held supremacy over the Iberian Peninsula. The Almohad of North Africa, her quote, protector, were now in decline themselves and no longer able to provide meaningful aid. The land was fractured into a handful of petty taifa states that would often war amongst each other, and the Christian Kingdoms of the North had consolidated their power. Most notably, Castile and Leon were now united under the warrior King Ferdinand III, who was destined to extend the Reconquista as never before. It would seem that the fall of Al-Andalus was now only a matter of time, but despite the chaos, there were those who were able to fight back. Of the two most prominent men to rise up, the stronger, at least at the beginning, was a man named Ibn Hud. He would gain the title, the Emir of the Muslims. He rallied a number of the great remaining taifa states together and raised an army. But when he attempted to push back the Reconquista, he was defeated on the battlefield repeatedly. Eventually, the great taifas withdrew their support. His own men turned on him, and at the gates of al-Ahmari, which was his last stronghold, he was killed, ironically, by the man he had placed in charge of the city. But despite this setback, there was another who would rise to prominence. Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr, known simply as Ibn al-Ahmar, was born into a very modest family in the very modest town of Aronha. Yet his family, the Banu Nasr, could trace their lineage back to a companion of the Prophet Muhammad himself, and perhaps this instilled in the man a sense of destiny. Despite his humble start, he was gifted with a cunning mind, charisma in abundance, and a very high sense of ambition. When the Almohad of North Africa essentially abandoned Al-Andalus to an uncertain fate, Ibn al-Ahmar saw an opportunity and seized it. In the year 1232, he was elected as leader of Aronha. The cities of Guadix and Baza would quickly follow suit, and in the following years, Jaén, Almería, and Malaga would also join him. But then in 1237, he truly hit the jackpot. The city of Granada, soon to be his capital, opened its doors and proclaimed him to be their new emir. The early career of Ibn al-Ahmar emphasized the highest principle of Sun Tzu's art of war: to win without fighting is best. Hugh Kennedy, a professor of Islamic studies, also explains, quote, Ibn al-Ahmar did not have to conquer any of the cities concerned. and the people seem to have been only too relieved to accept an effective leader. Thus, the foundations of the Kingdom of Granada were laid by consent, not by force." End quote. Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr had thus begun the Kingdom of Granada. His family name, the Banu Nasr, would be given to this new dynasty, and it would be known as the Nasrid. In this beginning, the characteristics that would allow the dynasty to endure became glaringly obvious. This was going to be a judicious and, in many cases, vicious diplomacy applied unapologetically to a ruthless conviction to survival. Ibn al-Ahmar's trademark would be to enter into and out of alliances with the Christian kingdoms, alternate between friend and foe with his Muslim rivals, and basically eliminate anybody he felt was standing in his way. Michael Berry, the author of the book An Homage to Al-Andalus, emphasizes this. Quote, "All throughout his career, Ibn al-Ahmar demonstrated his capacity as a master tactician, combining pragmatism, shrewdness, and a touch of deviousness." End quote. Hugh Kennedy goes on, quote, "At various times, Ibn al-Ahmar pledged his loyalty to Ibn Hud, the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, and the Hafsids of Tunis. All of these moves were temporary and tactical. More striking was his policy of accepting the Castilian alliance, buying peace for himself with the catastrophe of the other more expendable Muslims." End quote. When his greatest rival, the aforementioned Ibn Hud, died in 1238, the Emir of Granada was simply left the last man standing. While Granada was being established, the warrior kings of Castile, Portugal, and Aragon were on the offensive. Portugal, on one side of the peninsula, would push south to take all the land to the Algarve. Aragon, on the other side, would take the Balearic Islands and eventually capture Valencia. But they would both be overshadowed by Ferdinand III, king of a now united Castile-Leon, who would take more land than all of his ancestors. He managed to capture one taifa after the next. Mérida, Badajoz, Écija, Ubeda would in time raise the Castilian flag. Then in 1236 he took the city of Cordoba, the spiritual heart of Al-Andalus, and 10 years later he used his own ruthless diplomacy to take Jaén, which was one of Ibn al-Ahmar's strongholds. But Ibn al-Ahmar recognized the no-win scenario. He surrendered the city and became Ferdinand's vassal. While this may have seemed like a step in the wrong direction for the emir, the loss of Jaén would actually improve the borders of the Kingdom of Granada, as they would now be fixed along the ridge of the Sierra Nevada range. Now, being a vassal also meant that Ibn al-Ahmar was required to send military aid to assist Ferdinand III, even if this meant attacking fellow Muslims. Indeed, the emir and his cavalry were present during the siege of the last great independent taifa. They looked on as the city of Seville was taken by Castile in 1248. It was a strange place for Ibn al-Ahmar to be, especially as he had gained power on the premise of being a defender of the faith. But for the emir, the pact with Castile just had too many advantages. Becoming a vassal not only secured peace with Castile, but it also meant that Aragon and Portugal could no longer bring in their armies to attack, unless they wanted to risk an all-out war with Ferdinand III, who at this point had already proved his military prowess. Now, it goes without saying that there was a very heavy tribute that needed to be paid to Castile, but ironically enough, this established a precedence. The money flowing in from the emirate was just too good to pass up. And eventually, the military agenda of Castile became dependent on this cash flow. Basically, Granada became more valuable alive than dead. Now, after the fall of Seville in 1248, Granada would grow in prosperity under the inspiring leadership of its emir for the next 20 years. Ibn al-Ahmar used the time to build up a vast network of fortresses. He built them along the range of the Sierra Nevada to block nearly every pass and major crossroad. Meanwhile, the infrastructure of the land was enhanced and roads and bridges were upgraded. Strong points were established throughout the emirate as well, and armies and garrisons were created to man them. This new ruler was going to take every precaution. With the city of Jaén taken, he was painfully aware that his capital was a mere 50 miles to the Castilian border. The vast multitude of Muslim refugees that were fleeing the Christian advances would swell the population of the emirate. In a very short time, towns would become cities, and the capital, Granada, would explode with new residents. The emirate would become the most densely packed region of the peninsula. As a result, the economy flourished. Skilled tradesmen would start producing luxury goods. Agriculture would generate a vast assortment of crops. Wool was harvested and became an extremely lucrative trade item. And silk production, which one usually thinks of China, was cultivated and rendered into some of the most sophisticated textile in all of Europe. And just as a side note, silk production was done on a massive scale. The Almohad cartographer Al-Idrisi noted in his chronicle 3,000 farms raising silkworms, and over 800 workshops in Almeria alone spinning out some of the finest cloth. All of this would eventually make their way to the large and I should say well-protected southern ports of Algeciras, Malaga, and Almeria, the latter also being a major shipyard. And from there, the emirate would engage in trade throughout the entire Mediterranean. Her goods would reach North Africa, Western Europe, and the Italian city-states of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. The Emirate of Granada, while a fragment of the Caliphate of Cordoba, had established herself as a player in the Western Mediterranean. But from this time onward, she would be perpetually engaged in a dangerous game of shifting alliances. However, her goal was always clear, simply to survive. Ferdinand III died in 1252 and was succeeded by his son, Alfonso X, who had ambitions to invade North Africa. In 1262, this new Castilian king demanded from Ibn al-Ahmar both military support and that his vassal relinquish the ports of Tarifa and Algeciras. This was something that the emir simply couldn't do. He came up with 1,000 different excuses why he couldn't turn over the ports. And while he was diplomatically keeping Alfonso's demands at arm's length, he began to play his ace card. Far to the south, the Banu Marin were a nomadic Zenata Berber tribe that were renowned for their fighting abilities. They had been incorporated into the Almohad Caliphate and had served with valor in numerous campaigns. They gained the reputation of being some of the fiercest cavalry and foot soldiers the Caliphate could produce. But by the early to mid-13th century, the Almohad dynasty had entered into a death spiral, with one ineffectual leader after the next. The Banu Marin rose up in 1215 as a renegade force and began to seize territory for itself. At first, they were confined to the Rif Mountains, but by 1248 they had taken a score of cities, including Fez and Rabat. As they consolidated their power, a new sultanate was established, which after the tribe's namesake would be known as the Marinids. Now, after taking Marrakesh in 1269, they became the masters of Morocco. Their armies, which it should be said relied heavily on Christian mercenaries, had been honed after decades of fighting in the harsh lands of the Maghreb, and they were now eager for another fight. Ibn al-Ahmar, coming under increasing pressure from Castile, began hiring Marinid mercenaries to balance out his forces. He knew that a war was on the horizon and wanted to be one step ahead. In 1264, Alfonso X threatened the emir's life, and thus Granada and Castile declared war on one another. The emir was not going to do his opponent a slight injustice. If he went to war, he was going all in. He brought in an entire Marinid force, deployed his own army, and then invoked a massive rebellion of the Muslims that were living under Castilian rule in the recently conquered territories. These people were known as the Mudahars. The Mudahar rebellion spread quickly, and initially it was successful at overthrowing Castilian rule in a few cities. Alfonso X was staggered, and it required nearly all of his forces to contain the Muslim offensive, and this even after neighboring Aragon got involved. Eventually, the Castilian king invaded Granada, but even though he made it all the way to the capital, Castilian forces were finally turned back and defeated. This victory for Granada was achieved in part due to an elite Marinid cavalry force known as the Volunteers of the Faith, or the Guzat. Frustrated by his military setback, the Castilian king retaliated by instigating a rebellion within Granada. The Banu Ashqualullah were a prominent and powerful family that had been ardent supporters of the Nasrid, but had since become quite disaffected. Sensing their disillusionment, Alfonso provoked them into open revolt. This revolt, by the way, would last intermittently for the next 2.5 decades. The situation was spiraling out of control, and eventually both leaders had to settle on peace to address their respective domestic problems. But now a new equilibrium was established. First, Ibn al-Ahmar, the emir of Granada, who now took the name Muhammad I, proved without a doubt that his emirate was willing and capable of fighting back. Second, the Marinids of North Africa would increasingly become more involved both politically and militarily in the Iberian Peninsula, which seemed to them like fertile ground for their armies to plunder. And third, the Christian kingdoms of the north would increasingly expel the Muslims, but this expulsion wasn't always equal. Brian Catlos, in his book, The Kingdoms of Faith, explains, quote, "Although it is true that some Muslim communities in Christian Spain suffered catastrophic violence and repression, in many regions they enjoyed broad rights and lived in peace, security, and contentment, integrated to a remarkable degree with their Christian neighbors and overlords. Thus, it was not ideology or doctrine that most shaped policies towards the Mudahars, but practical concerns. Where the Muslims were seen as reinforcing the power of rulers and the prosperity of their kingdoms, their communities were protected and cultivated. When they were perceived of as threatening or a liability, or when it was simply more convenient to dispose of them, their rights were eroded or simply abrogated. This volatility was built into the Mudahar experience, and all but guaranteed that sooner or later the Muslim communities of Christian Spain would disappear." End quote. The peace that ensued was tenuous at best. Granada once again became Castile's vassal. But make no mistake, Castile had the military ability to attack at any point. It was within the capacity of Alfonso X to concentrate his military and complete the Reconquista. But he didn't. Alfonso X, who was a philosopher king, would be distracted at first by his attempt to become the Holy Roman Emperor, and then later by putting down another major rebellion, this time one that was started by his own son. This gave Muhammad I, again the new name for Ibn al-Ahmar, breathing room to build and keep his upstart nobles, the aforementioned Banu Ashqualullah, in check. His attention turned back to a hill in his capital, the Sabika, where, for years, he had been laying the foundation for a new palace city. His work, however, was cut short. He died in 1273 when he fell from his horse while he was on campaign. Maria Menecol, in her book, The Ornament of the World, puts this all into perspective. Quote, "Ibn al-Ahmar was able to enscone himself in the seclusion and relative safety of the Sierra Nevada. Shortly after he moved into Granada, he himself understood the perfection of the site at the top of the hill where the old red fort had stood. He began to prepare it to become a Palatine city, rebuilding fortified walls and bringing water to it from the mountains. He probably did not live to see much more than these foundations completed, but his son took over the task, and under his direction there began to rise the most spectacular of all the memory palaces of Islamic Spain, the Alhambra." End quote. The emirate existed in a state of perpetual threat, but the leadership of her emir and that of his descendants still found the time to create something awe-inspiring. As Professor Brian Catlos puts it, the Sultanate of Granada was a pale shadow of the old Caliphate of Cordoba, but the dynasty would rule for the next 250 years through what would be the final cycle of glory for Islamic Spain. End quote. Muhammad I was the first emir of Nasrid Granada and died at the age of 78. He gave to his son the rather conveniently named Muhammad II, a land that was well established but still with many challenges. The Christian kingdoms, while distracted with internal problems, were still powerful and dangerous. In the south, the Marinids were becoming an increasing threat. Their armies would begin to more frequently invade the Iberian Peninsula, and not always to the benefit of their Muslim co-religionists. And the Banu Ashqualala, the dominant noble house who helped bring the Nasrid to power, were still in revolt. To make matters more complicated, the Sultanate of Granada held a commanding position over the Strait of Gibraltar, which would only become more increasingly important as trade flourished, and this would only make her a bigger target. But the new emir who took power at the age of 38 was well experienced and groomed for the job. He also seemed to possess his father's cunning, near Machiavellian abilities. As it would turn out, many of the early emirs seemed to have this exact same trait, almost as if it was passed down in their DNA. Muhammad II's goal was the same as his father's: survival at any cost. He, too, would play the game of shifting alliances with expertise. He began his reign by putting down the Banu Ashqualala. This was going to be a grueling task that would take over a decade and became a civil war. During the civil war, the emir, like his father, artfully used the elite Marinid cavalry, the aforementioned al-Ghuzat al-Mujahideen, the warriors of jihad, also known as the volunteers of the faith. He did this so frequently that the Ghuzat, in time, became his own elite corps. In the end, after nearly a decade of fighting, Muhammad II proved successful. He drove his rival from one stronghold to the next, and in 1288, with no alternatives, the Banu Ashqualala departed the peninsula for the Maghreb forever. Now, to keep Castile occupied while all this was going on, the emir deviously managed to turn prominent members of the Castilian aristocracy against their own king. And when this wasn't enough, in 1275, Muhammad II invited in not just Marinid mercenaries, but their entire army. This incoming army ravaged the lands of Castile all the way to Toledo, but it came at a price for Granada. The Marinids took the ports of Algeciras and Tarifa, and now felt it was their, quote, duty to attack anytime they needed. Thus, another Marinid invasion happened in 1277. But then the game of alliances shifted once again, and when they returned in 1282, they ironically stormed Iberia to help Castile and to put Alfonso X back on the throne. And keep in mind that this would not be the last time that alliances would change. By the year 1291, Muhammad II had had enough of his North African ally. He made a treaty with the King of Castile, now Sancho IV, to retake Algeciras and Tarifa, which, to the credit of the Castilian king, was able to be accomplished the next year. But then, when Sancho IV refused to hand back the ports, the emir cancelled his treaty with Castile and re-established his alliance with the Marinids. And it would continue like this, around and around and around in a dizzying, chaotic political dance. I'll spare you the details. Now, suffice it to say, despite this precarious situation, Muhammad II still managed to come out in a strong position. He became Castile's vassal yet again, which did have the effect of keeping the other Christian kingdoms at bay. And then he got extremely lucky. Sancho IV died, leaving a 10-year-old son. Castile spiraled into a succession crisis and even a quasi-civil war. Even the Kingdom of Leon temporarily broke off, which, as can be imagined, would keep the new sovereign occupied for the foreseeable future. And on the other side of the Mediterranean, uprisings and revolt erupted across the entire Marinid Empire, forcing them to recall their troops again for the foreseeable future. Muhammad II was a very capable leader, and despite the consistent invasions, betrayals, and shifting alliances, he managed to consolidate the power of the Sultanate of Granada, expelled the Banu Ashqualala, subdued Castile and the Marinids, and harnessed the Ghuzat into his own elite fighting corps. The only thing that he failed to do was to foresee how he would be killed, which would come from a source that was perhaps more personal than he expected. Now, if I haven't mentioned this before, ruthlessness ran in the family of the Nasrid Dynasty. Muhammad II died unexpectedly in 1302. He was approximately 67 years old. The story of his death is shrouded in mystery. Some say he died of natural causes, some say he had a heart ailment that finally caught up with him, and others say his son, the also conveniently named Muhammad III, couldn't wait to take over. And if you're willing to believe this last tale, the story speaks of poisoning, but not your usual poison in the wine glass resulting in a quick death, boring routine. Muhammad II received a new assortment of clothing, and it was said that his new threads were too appealing to put to the wayside. And just about the time he got his new outfit, a banquet was called in his honor. Again, some sources say that his son, Muhammad III, arranged this feast. Thus, one is compelled to dress for the occasion. Anything less, well, that's just uncivilized. Donning his new attire, Muhammad II arrived in splendor. But unknown to him, his clothes were laced with poison. It was about halfway through dinner when he began to feel unwell and had to retire, at which point the poison lining was discovered, but by then it was too late. The doctors who attended to the emir spoke of an agonizing death, not in hours or days, but weeks. The account of it talks about chunks of flesh that literally fell from his bones, till there was nothing left but an animated skeleton, gasping for breath. But of course, this could just be a story, so take it for what it's worth. However, it should be noted that Muhammad III came to power in 1302 and was renowned through his short reign for episodes of bizarre cruelty, and eventually he would gain the title, the Deposed. And I'll just leave it at that. Now, Muhammad III was an aggressive emir that bolstered the army, but whereas his predecessors played the game of diplomacy, he opted for a much more militaristic stance. With Castile and the Marinids bogged down with succession issues and uprisings respectively, the new emir went on the offensive. In 1306, he took the city of Ceuta in Morocco, but having control of both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar was just too much for his enemies to bear. They all quickly sobered up from their domestic entanglements and combined their forces. Castile, Aragon, and the Marinids all declared war on the upstart Sultanate of Granada, which had dared to expand. Now, being at war on basically every front was bad for business and made the emir extremely unpopular. He was forced to abdicate in 1309 to his half-brother Nasser, but when he attempted to regain power, he failed. It was said that Nasser found him and personally dragged him to the Alhambra, where he had the deposed emir drowned in one of the pools of water in the palace city. Well, what can you say? Perhaps it was time for new leadership anyway. They say that fighting a two-front war is never a good idea. A three-front war is even worse. Nasser, the new emir, had to work fast to avoid getting completely wiped out. He ceded the cities of Ceuta and Algeciras to the Marinids, and for good measure he threw in the city of Ronda. While doing this would effectively give the North African Caliphate significant power over the Strait of Gibraltar, it would also make them a bigger target for everyone else, and by doing so the emir had secured his southern front. However, while he was negotiating with the Marinids, Castile invaded his western border and overran Gibraltar. And on his eastern front, Aragon began to lay siege to Almeria, both on land and with a naval blockade. Nasser had to move again quickly. He opened negotiations with Castile and gave the Castilian king full rights over Gibraltar. He calculated that this would put them into direct conflict with the Marinids. To sweeten the deal, the emir even relinquished several border towns and agreed to pay tribute. Thus, he saved his western front and in time would become allies with Castile once again. On his eastern front, he deployed his relatively limited military to bolster the defenses of Almeria against Aragon. The Aragonese siege was extensive, but the port city was now reinforced into a fortress. and as such, the siege would drag on and on. The defenders of the city, at one point running out of boiling oil to drop on the Knights of Aragon, used raw sewage instead, which, as it would turn out, was surprisingly effective. Seeing that their siege was going nowhere, Aragon withdrew and peace came to the Eastern Front. But this was not the end of Nasser's problems. Granted, he had inherited a militarily impossible situation from his predecessor, and even though his methods saved Granada, they also made him very unpopular as he was looked on as someone who could only appease his enemies. And his critics would accuse him of being too pro-Christian as his relations with Castile grew increasingly more casual. As it would turn out, it was his nephew, Ismail, that used the rising discontent to seize the throne, capture the capital, and plunge the emirate into civil war. Nasser was eventually exiled, but he wasn't done. When the opportunity was right, he went to Castile for help. When Nasser's envoy arrived, Castile was having issues of succession. The new king, Alfonso XI, was only 1 year old when his father had died. After what turned out to be an intense political struggle, his granduncle, the Infante John, and his uncle, the Infante Peter, became co-regents. In 1319, these two regents decided to back up Nasser and invade Granada. Of course, they didn't do this to be nice. They sensed an opportunity to take advantage of the emirate's internal divisions. A massive army was raised near Cordoba and received the blessing of Pope John XXII, thus making it a crusade. The Grand Masters of the Orders of Santiago, Alcantara, and Calatrava came along. Even the Archbishops of Toledo and Seville signed up. From the city of Cordoba, the army marched south, deep into the heart of the emirate. Castles and towns were seized and plundered along the way. This army made it all the way to Granada, and in the high summer, the siege of the capital began. But then their logistics began to fail. Getting water to supply such a force proved difficult at best. Furthermore, Granada's defenses proved to be impregnable. The technology of the time was not yet up for the challenge. On June 25th, the co-regents, John and Peter, began to withdraw. They were heavily loaded down with the spoils of the campaign. Peter, the younger of the two, took the vanguard. But that day there was an intense heat wave, and as a result, the men made slow progress. John took up the rear and tried to keep up, but as the intense sun bore into his contingent, the two portions of the army became separated. During this entire time, the emir, Ismail, had kept his army reined in, but his scouts had reported to him the disorganization of the Castilians. This was the opportunity that Ismail was waiting for. He mobilized the elite Guzat cavalry and sent them in to attack a portion of the separated Castilians. Their shock tactics took the Castilian rear by surprise and crippled it. Thus, John had to desperately call to Peter for help. But instead of rushing back immediately to help secure the line, Peter got into an intense discussion with his high command about what to do next. While this debate was raging on, the Castilians at the end of the line were being shattered. Peter, at the head of the army, finally decided to rush back to help. He raised his sword into the air and commanded his counterattack. But no sooner had he done this, he lost his grip on his saddle, fell from his horse, and his men, only hearing the word to attack, promptly trampled him to death. Now leaderless, the front of the army began to disintegrate. It became utter chaos. Many of the soldiers who were loaded down with plunder attempted to escape, but in their complete disorder, most ended up drowning as they struggled to cross the Rio Salado. But meanwhile, at the rear, John continued to watch his men fall to the remarkable and powerful attacks of the Guzat. But he would not be able to watch for very long. Between the intense heat and the extreme stress of the event, it was just too much for this elderly commander to take. As the battle engulfed him, his men noticed that he fell from his horse, but when they came to his aid, they discovered that he was already dead. Now, according to one chronicle, this was a heart attack, and according to another, this was a stroke. But what was known for sure was the fate of the Castilian army. It was completely destroyed. History would remember this as the disaster of the Vega. With both regions and most of the Castilian army now dead, the Kingdom of Castile was effectively neutralized. The chroniclers of the time would speak of the defeat in terms of entire towns being depopulated, frontier cities losing their garrisons, and years before the Castilian army could be effectively restored. History would remember this as the disaster of the Vega. With both regions and most of the Castilian army now dead, the Kingdom of Castile was effectively neutralized. The chroniclers of the time would speak of the defeat in terms of entire towns being depopulated, frontier cities losing their garrisons, and years before the Castilian army could be effectively restored. Ismail, who had proven to be a vigorous and effective leader, would go on to secure his position as the new Emir of Granada. He now definitively held the initiative, and just as it happened to turn out, in the next few years, he would also get his hands on a relatively new weapon. That's right, gunpowder. Ismail and the next two emirs, Muhammad IV and Yusuf I, would now turn the tables on Castile. One offensive after another, now backed up by cannon, was aggressively launched against their northern neighbor. The Guzat, again the elite cavalry, were unleashed with a vengeance. Granada proved her military might as it was finally her turn to recapture cities and fortresses along the border. The Marinids, who were well supplied with both money and manpower, would also take advantage of the situation. They landed in strength in 1329, destroyed a defending Castilian force, and took Algeciras. And then a mere 4 years later, the Marinids would team up with Granada and retake Gibraltar. But the Reconquista was by no means dead. By the time Gibraltar fell in 1333, the tide was inevitably turning. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Portugal, and Aragon still had significant manpower and resources. All the Christian kingdoms really needed was strong leadership and cohesiveness. As I mentioned before, Castile's king, Alfonso XI, was only a year old when his father died. He was only 8 when the Battle of the Vega claimed the lives of his regents and most of his army. Castile, in the aftermath of this disaster, was once again thrown back into a succession crisis. But finally, in 1325, Alfonso XI came to power. But make no mistake, his ascension was a very difficult time. He had to struggle to regain control over his throne and to secure his borders. But within his veins ran the blood of his warrior king forefathers. He was a descendant of Ferdinand III, after all. And thus, within a decade, he had put his aristocracy in line, subdued revolts, and rebuilt his army. What's more, with most of the ports of the Strait of Gibraltar in Muslim hands, Alfonso XI initiated a naval buildup. This buildup would not go unnoticed. The Marinids would do likewise, which resulted in a naval arms race. From the time of his ascension onwards, the new Castilian king made it clear that he had a very aggressive nature. Now granted, he would alternate between periods of war and peace with the emirate. But when he decided to take the offensive, he would blaze a path through Granada, inflicting major defeats along the way. And while he was doing this, he was still building up his navy. The long game for him was retaking the Strait of Gibraltar and isolating Granada from her North African allies. The way he figured was that if he was able to do that, he might just be able to complete the Reconquista. Now these exploits would not come cheap. Building a navy and maintaining an army is an expensive endeavor at the best of times. They would drain his economy, and by 1340, Castilian coffers were nearly empty. This year, by the way, 1340, would also be the year that everything would change. The naval arms race that was occurring had produced lethal navies for both the Marinids and the Castilians. A confrontation was inevitable. The North African Caliphate by this point had secured allies with the Muslims of Tunisia, and the two united their ships together, creating essentially an armada. Sensing this growing threat, Alfonso XI quickly brought in naval reinforcements from Aragon. In April of 1340, the two fleets met near Gibraltar. The Marinids and their allies, through deft maneuvering, got the upper hand and managed to surround the Castilian navy. By the end of that day, they had annihilated Alfonso's fleet. A full-flung invasion of Castile was now only a matter of time. The Marinid Caliph Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Othman, who, unlike Alfonso, had wealth in abundance, felt that it was his time to destroy his Christian rivals once and for all. With an uncontested sea, he raised a massive army and landed them in the Iberian Peninsula. This army was so massive that it took 2 weeks to bring in all of his troops. Of course, by this time, word of his naval victory had spread, and there is nothing like military success to encourage one's allies. The Emir of Granada, now Yusuf I, who, sensing an opportunity and not wanting to be left out on the spoils, decided to come in with his own army to reinforce the Marinids. Abu al-Hasan Ali, again the Marinid Caliph, was so confident that he led his troops personally, took with him piles of cash and luxuries, and even brought along most of his own family. I guess he wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You know, you take a military expedition and why not add on a family vacation? In late September 1340, the Muslim forces moved out of their marshalling areas and began to lay siege to Tarifa. This, by the way, was the last port in Christian hands that overlooked the Strait of Gibraltar. Meanwhile, Alfonso XI of Castile was in crisis mode. His navy was destroyed, he was completely outnumbered with a massive army on his doorstep, and there was almost no money left to raise more troops. He appealed to anyone that would listen for help. Luckily, the Pope declared his effort a crusade and released desperately needed funds. Thus, religious orders began to flock to his banner, and the King of Portugal, Alfonso IV, who happened to be his father-in-law, came to his aid. The Castilian king gathered his forces together near Seville, and from there he marched towards Tarifa, picking up allies along the way. On October 29th, he took up a position on a hill that overlooked the sea. It was approximately 5 miles north of Tarifa. That night, he deployed 1,000 of his knights and 4,000 of his infantry to loop around the Muslim besiegers and secretly enter Tarifa to reinforce the garrison. The maneuver went unnoticed, or at least unreported. The Caliph, Abu al-Hasan, ordered the siege of Tarifa to be lifted to deal with this new threat. With the two armies now facing off, it was clear that the Marinids had brought over a majority of their military power, and thus held the numerical superiority. The more credible sources had the combined Muslim force at about 65,000, whereas the Christian side was estimated to be only a mere 22,000. On the morning of October 30th, with his supplies running low, Alfonso XI decided to engage his enemy. Abu al-Hasan took up a position on a hill with the city of Tarifa to his rear. He deployed his son, Abu Umar, to his left flank, and Yusuf I of Granada took up a position on a nearby hill to secure the Marinid right. On the other side of the field, Alfonso placed his army for a broad frontal attack. He did this in order to use his heavy cavalry for what they were best known for, a massive charge. He then positioned his father-in-law, the King of Portugal, to secure his left flank. Now, if someone was to look at this from a purely analytical perspective, they would come to the conclusion that this was going to be a really difficult challenge. Not only was the Castilian king outnumbered with the sea to his back and running out of supplies, But the field itself was crossed by not just one but two shallow rivers, the Hara and the Salado. Now granted, in some areas they were not much more than streams, but they would still prove to be an obstacle. And even after these were crossed, the Castilians would have to charge uphill to engage the soldiers of the Caliph and the Emir. You can probably understand at this point why the Caliph and the Emir were feeling pretty secure. The battle commenced in mid-morning as Alfonso's men moved across the field. They crossed the Hara River without resistance, but crossing the Salado was going to be a much different story. The Marinids and the Granadans had advanced to the opposite bank, and despite the shallowness of the river, they were able to effectively block any crossing. Well, at least for a while. On the left flank, the Portuguese managed to finally ford the river and engage the Granadans directly in front of them. Meanwhile, on the right flank, the Castilians found a small bridge and, using heavy cavalry, managed to push back the Marinid defenders and cross the river. Seeing the Castilians crossing, Abu al-Hassan sent in his main force, and with a direct attack, they were able to stabilize the situation. But with his attention drawn to the battle ahead of him, the Caliph didn't notice what was happening behind him. Alfonso had ordered the garrison of Tarifa, again reinforced with his own knights and infantry, to exit the city and attack. This unseen force rode directly into the Muslim camp, destroyed the raw recruits that were left to defend it, and then charged down the hill into the rear of the Caliph's line. This was a completely untenable position, and in desperation, Abu al-Hassan ordered a last-ditch attack on Alfonso XI himself, who at this point had become isolated in the fight. The Castilian king drew his sword and was about to engage in hand-to-hand combat, only dissuaded at the last second by the Archbishop of Toledo, who literally had to drag the king back as his men fought on. Despite their numerical superiority, being attacked on nearly all sides was just too much for the Muslim position. The Caliph's men fought with intensity, but their formation disintegrated and collapsed. The Muslim army eventually had no other choice but to break and run. The Castilians and the Portuguese hunted down their fleeing enemy. This pursuit was nothing less than gruesome. Their combined cavalry rode down and slaughtered the men who were trying to escape, leaving in their wake a 5-mile-long path of carnage. Alfonso XI had grown up in the wake of the disaster at the Vega, but he had now revenged that battle and would be remembered by history with the title The Avenger. The Battle of Rio Salado, as it became known, was the place where the Marinid force was annihilated, which, as it would turn out, was a bulk of the Caliph's entire army. After 80 years of intervening in the Iberian Peninsula, the Marinids would never come back in force again. Indeed, the Caliphate would be devastated by the loss and would then enter into a period of rapid decline. The bottom line for Granada was that from this time onwards, North Africa was no longer going to be coming to the rescue, at least not in a major way. Now, going back to the battlefield for a second, in the Muslim camp, Alfonso XI also discovered the Caliph's massive treasury. The Castilian king, who at this point, for all intents and purposes, was, well, impoverished, would no longer be so. Now, to give you an idea of what kind of jackpot this was, the abundance he was able to secure was so great that it made gold markets throughout Western Europe plummet. The Castilian king, still quite in the prime of his life and now with cash in abundance, went to work expanding his army. And with the extra gold, he upgraded it with cannon. News of his victory attracted fighting men and crusaders from across Europe who flocked to his banner. Then, when he was ready, Alfonso XI launched one offensive after another against Granada. These attacks would really take their toll. Border cities would fall left and right. The armies of Granada that attempted to engage this incoming force would be destroyed, and fortresses that were once impregnable would no longer be so in the face of Castilian firepower. In the year 1344, Algeciras fell after a 2-year siege, her city walls having been battered down with artillery. This craft of using the big guns, by the way, would be something that Castile would only hone to perfection in the coming years. Granada continued to bring in Marinid mercenaries in a desperate attempt to turn the tide, but this was simply not enough. By the year 1350, with his opposition basically collapsing, Alfonso turned his attention to taking Gibraltar. His objective was to cut off North African reinforcements and secure the strait. Now, if he could accomplish that, he could move on to the bigger task of bringing down Granada once and for all. As the massive Castilian force came to lay siege to Gibraltar, it would seem that Granada's days were numbered. The emir could only look on as his opponent maneuvered into place and wondered how much time was left. On the night of March 25th in the year 1350, the siege of Gibraltar was well underway. Alfonso XI confidently reviewed his troops and was anticipating a good campaign ahead of him. And why not? He had a massive army, plenty of money in the bank account, his enemy was essentially on the ropes, and he had the will to fight. But strangely enough, despite being only 39 years old, that night he began to feel extremely weak and came down with a horrendous fever. Peculiar purplish-black spots began to appear on his body, expanding and growing, and only in a short period of time. What's more, many of the men in his army began to develop the exact same affliction. Alfonso XI was a true warrior king of Castile. He was the victor of Rio Salado, was responsible for kicking most of the Marinids out of the peninsula, and would be known to history as the Avenger. He was perhaps in one of the best positions to complete the Reconquista. But instead, the following morning he was found dead. And alongside him, much of his immense army had also died in the night. Because you see, the time of the Black Death had arrived. The Castilian siege of Gibraltar had dragged on for many months. This was a testament to the ingenuity of her defenders. The Nasrid, the dynastic rulers of Granada, had taken ownership of the city in 1333 and had set to work on the defenses. Like with many of their other cities, they had rendered it into a fortress. However, every morning the Nasrid garrison watched as the siege camp that surrounded them grew ever bigger. This was Alfonso XI's second attempt to take Gibraltar, and the warrior king of Castile was more determined than ever. After his great victory over the Marinids of North Africa at the Battle of Rio Salado, the Granadans were on their own and essentially up against the ropes. Meanwhile, Alfonso was in the prime of his life. He had a vast army, he had the initiative, and a lot of money. But it was rumored that he had gone so far as to liquidate the crown jewels to pay for even more reinforcements. This king wanted to complete the Reconquista so badly that he could taste it, and Gibraltar was a major stepping stone to that conquest. Thus, he was fully committed, and therefore the hum of activity on the other side of Gibraltar's walls had gotten progressively louder over the months. The sound would have been overwhelming: the constant taunts, the creation of siege towers, cannon slowly being moved into position, and men marching and refining their weapons, all with the intent that one day they'd be able to either starve the Muslims out or, plan B, storm the defenders and, with any luck, kill them. Now, whether the defenders simply got used to this scene or if there was a justifiably increasing panic within their ranks is hard to say. But in March of 1350, something very odd happened. The noise began to diminish and a strange silence descended on the Castilian camp. Now, in my mind, I imagine some poor unfortunate soul having to draw the short straw and, under the cover of a moonless night, having to venture forth to figure out what was going on. If so, this man would have come back screaming. He would have discovered an enemy siege camp that was full of dead bodies. The plague here had done its sinister work. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, thought to be the main culprit to the Black Death, had killed off a big chunk of the Castilian army, and the bacteria made no distinction between rank and royalty. Amongst all those bodies was the corpse of Alfonso XI, one of the most aggressive and militarily skillful kings of Castile was cut down at the height of his power, and mind you, just as he was on the verge of completing the Reconquista. By this point in history, the Black Death had been killing in Europe for well over 3 years, and would still have another 3 years to go. While it would kill off more than a third of the European population, it would ironically save Nasrid Granada. The contemporary historian Ibn al-Khatib would comment, quote, "King Alfonso was within reach of obtaining the whole peninsula, yet as he besieged Gibraltar, Allah in his great wisdom favored the faithful in their extremity." End quote. A new page had been turned in the fortunes of Granada, which at this point seemed like it was on the verge of annihilation. The Sultan, Yusuf I, may have sensed this change, and as a gesture of goodwill, he not only allowed the remains of the Castilian army to retreat back to Seville through his territory in peace, but he also allowed them to carry the body of their king with them. Now, some claim that this was just an act of chivalry. I would say that this was an act of skillful diplomacy. Yusuf was in it to play the long game, and he already had his eyes set on rebuilding his kingdom. Yusuf was someone who could see a step or two ahead, and he knew that with the death of Alfonso XI, along with most of his impressive army, that a new equilibrium would be established. Essentially, he wanted to win the peace, but Yusuf was not going to be able to enjoy this new playing field for very long. A mere 4 years later, on October 19th in the year 1354, as he was praying in a mosque in Granada, a man rushed up, evaded his guard, and plunged a dagger directly into his back. Now, according to some accounts, this attacker was a madman, whereas others have him down as being a hired assassin. But either way, the end result would have worked out exactly the same. The Sultan cried out for help, but his followers could do little but watch as the pool of blood beneath him expanded. He was carried back to his private chambers in the Alhambra, only to die shortly thereafter. With the death of this sultan, it was now time for a new generation of leadership, both in Granada and in Castile. Yusuf I was succeeded by his son Muhammad V in 1354. Alfonso XI was succeeded by his son Peter of Castile in 1350. Both men would be approximately 16 years old when they respectively came to power. Both would be destined to leave interesting legacies. And ironically enough, considering how belligerent their fathers were towards one another, these two men would instead be friends, and between the two of them would usher in a time of peace and prosperity between the Kingdom of Castile and the Sultanate of Granada. The story of the king and the sultan was perhaps one of the most intriguing in history, but it's with Muhammad V that our tale really begins. His rise to power was difficult to say the least because Granada had many contenders for the crown. And to complicate matters, his father had named him heir to the Sultanate at the very last second, which, as can be imagined, bred considerable discontent with his half-brothers, who seemed to know how to hold a grudge. However, Muhammad V had the backing of his father's Hajib, his chamberlain, who commanded the Guzat, which was the famous elite cavalry corps. You know, if you're coming to power, always helps to have the military behind you. He also had the backing of his father's most prominent vizier, statesman, and preeminent scholar, a man by the name of Ibn al-Khatib. So Muhammad had the brains and the brawn on his side. These men, along with the remains of his father's cabinet, initially, emphasis on that word, nurtured the young sultan and guided him well. Muhammad V was remembered for many things, but his strength lay in his diplomatic abilities. His first order of business was to cement the peace and secure his borders. Granada, after all, was still recovering from the military onslaught of Alfonso XI. Thus, Muhammad sent out delegations to the Marinids of Morocco, the Hafsids of Tunis, and even so far as the Mamluks of Egypt. He also sent envoys to the court of Aragon, but his biggest neighbor and number one priority was the Kingdom of Castile to the north. The Sultan was quick to re-establish his position as Peter of Castile's vassal, which on one end meant that he had to pay tribute, but on the other, it also implied that the Castilian king would provide protection. However, this turned out to be a double-edged sword. Peter of Castile, who would later be known by many other names, more on that in a bit, would go to war against Aragon in 1358. Muhammad, as his vassal, was obliged to provide military support. Thus, Granada got sucked into this war in more or less a supportive role. For example, Muhammad V would open up his Mediterranean ports to Castilian ships for the purposes of resupply and dry dock. But later, as the war expanded, Nasrid land and sea forces were also sent into the fray. Now keep in mind that Granada had been heavily ravaged by the Black Death and really didn't have the capacity for a prolonged conflict. This war would prove to be both unpopular and massively consuming for the new Sultan, and his enemies were quick to exploit it. In August of 1359, the coup began. Assassins were sent into the Alhambra by Muhammad V's half-brother, Ismail II, and his cousin, who'd be known to history as Muhammad VI. Many members of the upper aristocracy were killed, but the young Sultan, along with his vizier Ibn al-Khatib, along with the remaining members of his cabinet, managed to escape, and not just the city, but the entire peninsula. And this is where Muhammad V's diplomatic finesse paid off. He was welcomed with honors into the Marinid court in Fez, where he'd go into exile. Ibn al-Khatib would render this expulsion into poetry. Quote, "The hand of exile has already sown the seeds of mourning, and our chests have become constricted by the anguish that burns within them. We cried one evening by the river's sweet waters, and the waters turned to salt." End quote. Peter of Castile at this time was too busy engaged in the war against Aragon to come to his aid, and so Ismail II claimed the throne of Granada and was backed up by his co-conspirator, the aforementioned Muhammad VI. The young poor Sultan, now in exile, had lost his proverbial crown at the tender age of 21. This happened a mere 5 years after coming to power and took place by the hand of his own family. Muhammad V would remain in exile in Fez for the next 3 years, but it was in Fez that he learned from his Marinid host. He was entranced by the architecture and the knowledge that surrounded him. And he was not the only one to be dazzled. His vizier, Ibn al-Khatib, who had joined him in exile, was also duly impressed. As I've mentioned before, Ibn al-Khatib was a polymath. He was a writer, a politician, a poet, even a historian. Ibn al-Khatib had worked for many years at the highest levels of the Emirates government. He had established himself as a very knowledgeable man. As a result, the young Sultan favored his wisdom, and a strong bond was created between the two. It was during this time of exile in Fez that Ibn al-Khatib became acquainted with the court poet, a man named Ibn Zamrak. This man had also followed the Sultan into exile and had a remarkable intellect. Ibn al-Khatib recognized this and took the poet, Ibn Zamrak, under his wing and nurtured him. He promoted him up the line and eventually introduced him to Muhammad V. These three men immediately hit it off, creating a powerful working association. They used their time in Morocco wisely, gaining insight from one another, advancing their respective knowledge, and plotting how one day they would return to their homeland in Granada. Now, meanwhile, back in Granada, things had gone from bad to worse. Ismail II was a very ineffective ruler. He was very vain, he was somewhat effeminate, he angered the nobles, alienated the people, and it wasn't long until his co-conspirator, that is the other guy who helped lead the coup, if you recall, Muhammad VI, decided to rise up and overthrow him. And surprisingly, this wasn't that hard to do. Ismail II was captured, and I should add very quickly, before being dragged in chains to the dungeons below Granada, where he was tortured in horrific ways and then summarily executed. And again, this happened by the hand of his own family. What's that old statement? Payback is a... how does that go? Now, where Ismail II may have come across as a bit unmanly, Muhammad VI, who replaced him, was very much the opposite. He was coarse, rough around the edges, and with bright red hair. The Castilians would even go so far as to call him El Bermejo, the redhead. El Bermejo lacked diplomatic finesse, but he made up for this with boldness, even if it was a bit misdirected and some would argue even crazy. In fact, he was so bold that he canceled Granada's tribute to Castile and threatened to become allies with Aragon. Now, if you were Peter I of Castile, engaged in a mortal struggle with Aragon, and your vassal decided to turn off the tap of funds just when you needed it the most and then opted to become allies with your most hated enemy, how would that make you feel towards this new ruler? It would be a bit of an understatement to say that Peter had had enough of this and desperately needed Muhammad V out of exile and back in the throne. Now, as all of this was going on, back in Morocco, the Sultan in exile had been busy gathering his followers into a fighting force. In 1361, he landed back in the Emirate and rallied his forces at the city of Ronda. He was able to bring together a sufficient army to go on the offensive, and from here he marched out, taking a bunch of surrounding cities. Peter of Castile, during a ceasefire with Aragon, came to the Sultan's aid and retook several border cities. In doing so, the Castilian king pinned down El Bermejo's army, which in turn gave Muhammad V the initiative, and thus in March of 1362 the Sultan retook the port city of Malaga. With this victory, Muhammad V had managed to turn the tide. El Bermejo, who was becoming increasingly despised by his own people and on hearing of the loss of Malaga, panicked and fled from Granada with his family and his remaining supporters. Being such a nice guy, he decided to raid the treasury on the way out the door. El Bermejo was, how do I say this kindly, not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. Of all the places that he could have run to, he decided to go to Castile and throw himself at the mercy of Peter. Now, remember when I said that Peter I of Castile had many names? One of his names was Peter the Just, but he was also known as Peter the Cruel. Brian Catlos, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, describes what happened next. Quote, "What followed was one of the many occasions that Peter would live up to his infamous nickname, the Cruel. The day after El Bermejo and 36 of his dignitaries were treated by the Castilian king to a welcome feast, Peter had them taken out to a field where he personally drove his lance into El Bermejo before ordering the rest to be slaughtered in cold blood. As an act of amicable courtesy, Peter had their heads sent back to Muhammad V as gifts. As for the abundant treasure El Bermejo had brought with him, Peter kept that for himself." End quote. Muhammad V was now restored as the ruler of Granada, and his strong working relationship with the Castilian king was reestablished. The golden age of the Nasrid had begun. For nearly the next 30 years, Muhammad V would rule Granada through an age of peace and prosperity that was unrivaled in the history of the Nasrid Dynasty. His true strength lay in his cunning use of diplomacy and knowing when and where to act. The man was a proverbial chess master of international relations. He had that insight to see 4 steps ahead and what would and would not favor him. He would re-establish peace treaties with his Muslim neighbors along the entire length of North Africa, from the Marinids of Morocco to the Hafsids of Tunisia and even the Mamluks of Egypt. He would then do the exact same thing with the Christian Kingdoms of the North. This peace that he established allowed trade to flourish. And with this trade came not only a boost to his economy, but an influx of cultural exchange. This would be a time when art, architecture, literature, and even medicine would blossom and prosper. Peter I, again Peter the Cruel of Castile, would be enamored by his vassal's prosperity. Michael Barry, in an homage to Al-Andalus, describes this, quote, Peter I of Castile was fascinated by the exceptional Muslim architecture, which was considered by many to be the most brilliant of the time. This appreciation was demonstrated by Peter's construction of the extraordinarily graceful Real Alcazar in Seville, which he began in 1364. This was built on an earlier Almohad building in the Islamic style using Granadan craftsmen. It was constructed during the same era as the Alhambra buildings, with many of the styles and techniques being similar." End quote. But the Castilians were not the only ones to be engaged in a robust building program. Muhammad V would use his growing power and economy to rebuild castles, reinforce existing fortifications, expand port facilities, and even build hospitals for his people like the famous Maristan of Granada. However, without question, his greatest lasting legacy was that of the Alhambra. Washington Irving, who was an early 19th century writer who, how do we say this politely, took a lot of liberty in describing the intrigue of the Nasrid court, would state, quote, "Perhaps there never was a monument more characteristic of an age and a people than the Alhambra. A rugged fortress without, a voluptuous palace within, war frowning from its battlements, and yet poetry breathing through the fairy architecture of its halls." End quote. The Alhambra was one of the greatest family heirlooms in history. Its name was derived from the term Alhambra, meaning the red one, which was a description of the red soil on which it was built. Its position on the Sabica hill was superbly defensible, and at one point in history this was the site of a Roman fort. Later, in the mid-11th century, it was converted into a full-time fortress. The location inspired awe and caught the eye of Muhammad I, again the founder of the Nasrid Dynasty. Now remember, this man had to fight in very uncertain times, and this showed in his initial plan. He laid down the foundations in 1238 and specifically began construction to revamp the outer fortifications. He reinforced the walls and upgraded them to contain mixtures of stone, adobe, and sand. This was engineered with the intention that the outer walls could better resist impact. Strong points, gates, arrow slits, and other defenses were also integrated into the master design. Furthermore, Muhammad I rebuilt the citadel on the westernmost approach known as the Al-Kazaba. To help withstand any potential siege, the river Darro was rerouted and an aqueduct was built to ensure that water would flow through the site. The Alhambra was built to withstand just about any attack. Muhammad I didn't want just a simple fortress, but rather a fully operational battle station. Now nearly each sultan that came down the line would add a piece. Muhammad III, who was known for his bizarre cruelty, built the Partal, which comprised of the Tower of the Ladies, its surrounding gardens, and its magnificent reflecting pool. It was Ismail I that was regarded as the creator of the summer palaces, located in the vast garden area known as the Generalife. And Yusuf I helped in the creation of the Court of the Myrtles, with its long pool in the middle. Now Muhammad V, not to be outdone, would add one of the most iconic of all structures. This was an addition that showed the wealth and success of his reign: the Court of the Lions. Ibn Zamrak, the court poet, who if you recall had followed Muhammad V into exile, now contributed his poetry to adorn the walls. Along the basin of the Fountain of the Lions, Ibn Zamrak added, quote, "Such a translucent basin with sculpted pearl, ripples are added on by the quiet dew. Liquid and solid, marble and water, which one is truly running? See how the water overflows the borders. They are like the lover who in vain tries to hide his tears from his beloved." End quote. This was the apogee of the Nasrid. Muhammad V's contribution with his shrewd leadership and suave politique, I've described him before as a chess master, was nearly unsurpassed by the entire Nasrid dynasty. But a great portion of his success lay in the fact that the other opponents on the board were all distracted and busy trying to kill each other. Just to the north, his friend and ally Peter the First of Castile would be engaged in not just one, but a series of wars. These conflicts would consume nearly all the major players of Western Europe. Now, when the dust would finally settle from these prolonged engagements, the political scene would be changed forever, and it would end up costing Peter the First more than he could possibly have imagined. Nasrid Granada during this time ironically enjoyed a golden age, but like with all golden ages, this one too would come to an end. As Muhammad V was doing his best to establish and win the peace for the Kingdom of Granada, Peter I of Castile was doing just the opposite. The King of Castile would be engaged in an almost constant state of war from the time of his ascension in 1350. He would fight Aragon, the French, and even his own brother. But before we can truly judge him and determine if he actually lived up to the name, Peter the Cruel, it should be noted that the seeds for his belligerent career were sown much earlier. You see, the way it worked out was that his father, Alfonso XI, was not just one of the more aggressive Castilian kings in history, but was also a man who was very adept at siring children. In 1334, Alfonso's wife, Maria of Portugal, gave birth to Peter I. With that whole male heir thing out of the way, Alfonso decided to take on a mistress, and for the record, he wasn't exactly shy about showing her off. She was a noblewoman that had descended from the aristocracy of what was once the Kingdom of Leon. Her name was Eleanor de Guzman. As can be imagined, Alfonso's wife, Maria, was not exactly happy with the idea of her husband running off into the arms of another woman. And when that other woman, again Eleanor, gave birth to a child, that is, his child, well, that for the queen was just no good. I could also see Maria being upset when Eleanor gave him his second child and then the third. When he got up to 5 children, and I'm guessing here, Maria was probably really angry. I can only imagine what Maria must have felt when it got to number 10. Now, if that doesn't breed resentment in a person, I'm not sure what would. When Alfonso XI died of the plague during his siege of Gibraltar, Maria's first act was to make sure her son was installed as the new king. Her second act was to round up Eleanor de Guzman, have her imprisoned, and then executed. I'll just leave it up to your imagination to determine what Maria did to her before she had Eleanor offed. However, Eleanor's children for the most part survived, and in time would collectively be given the title, the House of Trastamara. An agreement was reached where they could live peacefully alongside Peter, but these children too knew how to hold a grudge. The fourth child of Alfonso XI and Eleanor de Guzman was a man named Henry, known politically as Henry II. He was born the same year as Peter, and to be clear, he was actually a few months older, which could be argued that he was kinda more in line to be the next king. When he was older, he was made Count of Trastamara by his father, hence the derivation of the name that he would best be remembered by history, Henry of Trastamara. Almost immediately after Alfonso XI's death and the ascension of Peter I, Henry and his brothers began to rebel and gain supporters. This was the beginning of a civil war that would gain steam as time went on, and you can't really blame him. Henry and his side of the family were infused with both a desire to claim the throne and to revenge the execution of their mother. And they were fully committed. This was one of those go big or go home, that is in a body bag, kind of moments. His rebellion was squashed quickly by Peter, but strangely enough he was pardoned by the Castilian king only to rise up in rebellion again. Henry would flee to Portugal and then to France. Each time he did this, again strangely enough, he was pardoned over and over only to rise up in revolt over and over. However, that said, with each reiteration he would learn and more importantly would seek out and gain new allies for his cause. And it wasn't just that he was good looking or charismatic or knew what to say, he was very lucky. The political scene in Europe at that time in history just happened to be ripe with opportunity. Now, to really comprehend what happened next, one must have an understanding of the insanely complex system of politics that existed not just in Iberia, but in Western Europe. And I'll be the first to admit that I can't even begin to give this true justice, but for the sake of clarity, there were three major fights that were occurring, each at a different level of zoom. At the grandest level, England and France, with respective allies, were engaged in the 100 Years' War. And for the record, despite its namesake, this war started in 1337 and would go on for 116 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. This was a conflict that was so long that historians had to divide it up into segments of time named after respective kings: the Edwardian phase, the Lancastrian phase, etc. England at this point had given France 2 black eyes, first by defeating them at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, and then again at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. But France was still powerful and very much in the fight, so both sides were looking for new allies to help in the conflict and to geographically outflank their opponent. They were going to find some really good opportunity for this in the Iberian Peninsula. On the next level of zoom, you had the war between Castile under Peter I and Aragon under Peter IV, which started in 1356. This was aptly known as the War of the Two Peters. It was a grinding border conflict that drained the resources of everyone involved. And just the same as England and France, both Castile and Aragon were looking for someone to ally themselves with. Now, on the highest level of zoom, you had the above-mentioned ongoing fight that was the War of Succession between Peter and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, known as the Castilian Civil War. Like I said, the whole thing was a complicated mess, and this is how it played out. By 1356, Peter I had secured his hold on the Castilian throne, and had managed, at least for the most part, to keep his half-brother Henry somewhat under control. With this lull in the Castilian Civil War, Peter I decided to take on his neighbor to the east and invaded Aragon, which, if you recall, was under the rule of Peter IV. Again, this was known as the War of the Two Peters. This conflict was characterized by daring raids, the rapid capture of forts and castles, but then interspaced by truces that essentially just reset the board. For example, Castile invaded in 1357 and then again in 1361. In both campaigns, it would claim territory in some relatively minor towns, only to give them back via treaty for other concessions. The indecisiveness was grating, and it looked as if the War of the Two Peters was going to become a war of attrition. Thus, in 1362, the Castilian king, who desperately wanted to break the deadlock, allied himself first with Navarre and then later with both England and Portugal. Then, without a formal declaration of war, he launched a full-scale invasion. The King of Aragon was blindsided. When the invasion happened, he was off conducting business in France. Some historians felt that he was trying to establish an alliance with the French in order to strengthen his own position, and perhaps his plan was to launch a sneak attack against Castile. His timing, however, was really bad. Aragon was caught with its proverbial pants down. Castilian forces overran the border and began to take one city after the next. They were so successful that by the next year they invaded what was known as the Kingdom of Valencia and took the strategic port of Alicante. Peter IV of Aragon desperately needed to reverse the situation and invoked the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." If Castile was allied to England, well then, Aragon would be tied into the French, who were themselves looking for partners. Remember, the 100 Years' War was still far from over. Then the Aragonese king, invoking Machiavelli's line, "Never do your opponent a slight injustice," would begin negotiations with Henry of Trastamara, who was looking for a way to get back at his half-brother, and readily agreed to an alliance as well. Thus, the personal fight between Peter I of Castile and his brother, Henry of Trastamara, had now become a portion of a vast international fight. And make no mistake, both sides of this ever-growing system of alliances were gonna bet big on who was gonna win this personal fight between the two Castilian brothers. In 1366, Henry of Trastamara, who was reinforced by Aragon, who in turn were backed up by the French, opened up a new front and invaded Castile with his own army. His deft maneuvering completely took his half-brother by surprise. Peter was forced to flee, first to Galicia and then to the English-held city of Bayonne. The shock-and-awe tactic of Henry had worked perfectly. Peter had lost his throne, his allies began to desert him, and even Muhammad V of Granada, his friend, vassal, ally, and architectural soulmate, had defected to the Trastamara side, truly a low point for Peter. But there was still one who would back him up. Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince, also known as the King of England, could not afford to lose the Iberian front to Aragon, who was allied to France, his long-term enemy. Edward, after all, had been at the Battle of Crécy and was the victor of the Battle of Poitiers. In both engagements, he had crushed the French, and I would argue that he rather enjoyed it. The man was known for his bellicosity. Therefore, losing was not something he truly relished, especially not to the French, or for that matter, their allies. Taking out a lot of loans, the English king decided to help put Peter I back on the Castilian throne. Peter, in turn, agreed to give him lands, secure trade routes, and most importantly, repay the insane amount of money that was borrowed. An army of approximately 10,000 men comprised of European mercenaries, English soldiers, and longbowmen was assembled. Then Peter and Edward marched their way through Navarre, picking up more allies before going on the offensive into Castile. When Henry of Trastamara was alerted of this incoming force, he rallied as many troops as he could and brought in his best commanders. This included a Breton knight by the name of Bertrand du Guesclin. Henry was outnumbered nearly 2-1, but masterfully used guerrilla-style tactics to harass and disrupt his brother's army. He was able to inflict a lot of casualties with his hit-and-run tactics, especially on the English. However, despite his attempt to avoid a direct confrontation and whittle down his enemy as best he could, on April 3, 1367, he had no other choice, and both forces finally engaged one another at the Battle of Nájera. This would turn out to be a gruesome fight with extensive casualties on both sides. But in the end, Henry was soundly defeated and his army was nearly destroyed. Even his best commander, the aforementioned Bertrand du Guesclin, was captured. But ironically enough, this was to prove more costly for Peter. When the dust had finally settled from this confrontation, both Peter and Edward began to ask their subordinates had Henry been somehow killed or apprehended. To their shock and utmost dismay, the answer was no. Not only did Henry of Trastamara manage to escape, but he made it all the way back to France, where he would rebuild his army and live to fight another day, thus assuring the fact that the Castilian Civil War would simply have to continue. For the time being, however, Peter I retook the throne of Castile and was able to re-establish ties with Granada. Muhammad V, seeing Peter's success, changed sides once again and became his vassal. The Sultan of Granada, being a bit of an opportunist, even made it a point to attack and capture, that is, for himself, Castilian cities like Jaén, Ubeda, and Baeza, which at the time were still holding out against Peter's re-established rule. For the purposes of a good PR, the Sultan sold this maneuver as neutralizing the rebel scum that was opposing the new ruler, and the Castilians completely bought into it. And so Granadan forces would pour over the Castilian border, where they managed to capture a lot of territory. Indeed, Muhammad V even came within a hair's breadth of retaking Cordoba. Peter I of Castile really didn't seem to mind. He did, after all, have his crown back. But while he had regained the throne, holding on to it was going to prove to be really difficult. First and foremost, he had no money in the treasury and could not exactly pay the King of England back. That sum, by the way, was enormous and it would ruin Edward. Suffice it to say, the alliance between Castile and England came to an end. Peter was now politically isolated, but he was losing even more on the home front. Professor Catlos explains, quote, "The length and cost of the war pushed his kingdom further into debt, sapping Peter's already flagging popularity. The increasingly unstable king inflicted his subjects with ever more burdensome taxes. and tortured and executed anyone suspected of disloyalty, including members of his own family. Soon he faced open revolt by his own nobility and the major towns of the realm." End quote. It was argued by historians that Peter during this time earned his title Peter the Cruel. He would literally have people who were, quote, disloyal brought before him and executed in front of everyone, and this would include several members of the House of Trastamara, that is, his other half-brothers. But while Peter was slowly losing his grip on his kingdom and some would argue his mind, Henry of Trastamara was busy preparing for round two. In 1369, Henry had rebuilt his army and then made a formal alliance with France, who supported him with additional military force. Then, with his second wind, he invaded Castile once again. Bertrand du Guesclin, again his best commander, who at this point had ransomed his way back to freedom, decided to join Henry on the march. I guess in the end, the Breton knight had a score to settle himself. In response, Peter rushed to mobilize his own army. The English, who did not want to be outdone by the French, grudgingly sent in troops, and even Granada provided some military force. On March 14, 1369, the two armies met at what would be known as the Battle of Montel. It was once again brother versus brother, backed up by France and England respectively. The fight was absolutely dreadful, but this time it was Peter who would lose ground and watch his army disintegrate. Towards the end, it was said that only the Knights of Granada were left to defend him. Henry had emerged victorious, and in a reverse of their prior engagement, Peter now had to run for his life. The Castilian king, with very few options, fled the battlefield and took shelter in the nearby castle of Montiel. But he was quickly pursued, surrounded, and then cut off by Bertrand du Guesclin. After a few days of seeing that he was trapped, Peter sent out a messenger to Bertrand to see if the Frenchman could be bribed. The offer was very generous, but Bertrand needed a moment to think about it. Finally, after giving it due consideration, he took the offer to Henry of Trastamara and said, "This cowardly King Peter is trying to bribe his way out of a bad situation. How could anyone with any honor possibly accept this?" Of course, towards the end of their conversation, Bertrand added, "Well, can you beat this?" So a message was sent back to Peter trapped in his castle with a plan. The plan was for Peter to come down from his battlements and to meet up with Bertrand in a tent to start negotiations, or some would call this bribery. Either way, Peter readily complied, walked in, and began to shake hands with the Frenchman, offering him great terms. But just a few moments after Peter had come in, Henry of Trastamara entered the tent as well. That look of knowing one has been completely betrayed began to cross Peter's face, and he knew then and there that this was going to end badly. All of those years of hatred, of fighting both on and off the battlefield, the animosity of the two brothers were etched like scars into their faces. Chris Lowney, in his book A Vanished World, gives one account, there are others which are more dramatic, of what happened next. Quote, "Late one night in March of 1369, Count Henry of Trastamara entered the tent of his estranged half-brother, King Peter of Castile. So much time had passed since their last meeting that Henry first had to verify with a retainer that the man standing before him was indeed his brother, Peter, the king. When this was verified, Henry pulled out a dagger, lunged forward, and stabbed Peter in the face, wounding him again and again and again. The monarch crumpled to the ground, but Henry continued his attack. When this was over, Henry immediately assumed Castile's throne as King Henry II. His brother's bloated, stinking corpse lay unburied and untended for 3 days before Henry permitted burial. Such are the bloody roots of the Trastamara dynasty." End quote. The Castilian Civil War had finally ended. The Trastamara dynasty had begun. And mark my words, this dynasty would have an incredible impact not just on Castile, but the entire world. The political landscape was now drastically different. The Christian kingdoms had severely battered each other down, and they were not yet done fighting. Meanwhile, Muhammad V continued his long reign and tried his best to stay out of any conflict. Granada was enjoying a time of great prosperity. A prosperity, mind you, that was not won by war, but rather by the Sultan's astounding diplomacy. Muhammad V had managed to stay out of the fighting in Iberia as much as possible, and at the same time he managed to keep his neighbors in North Africa happy with skillful negotiations. The Sultan had essentially won the peace, and his kingdom showed it. The attitudes of the various countries were now somewhat reversed. In the wake of Peter the Cruel's death, both Aragon and Castile, which was now under the Trastamara dynasty, would now vie with one another to have Granada as an ally. And what made this whole situation even more plausible was that at the time, neither kingdom had the military capacity to seriously threaten the emirate. Thus, with this newfound confidence, Muhammad V would actually expand his territory. He was able to retake border cities, recapture Gibraltar, and thereby assert Granadan dominance over the strait, which, as can be imagined, did wonders for both trade and his economy. Muhammad V's reign marked the apogee of the Nasrid Dynasty, and the Kingdom of Granada would flourish in the midst of a golden age. But as I've said before, all golden ages, and this one was no exception, would come to an end. Upon the death of Muhammad V in 1391, the Nasrid dynasty would descend into a period of utmost turmoil. Muhammad V's son, Yusuf II, would reign for barely a year before being assassinated, and from that time onwards, internal discord would only increase as various factions attempted to gain power. It should be noted that the historical record of the Nasrid from the 15th century onward was very limited. This was a testament to a civilization that was going into a massive decline. The descendants of Muhammad V seemed to lack his diplomatic finesse, and as such, Granada would become entangled in various conflicts. And furthermore, the emirate's once strong leadership began to completely dissolve. Michael Berry, in his book An Homage to Al-Andalus, explains, quote, "The final decades of Granada were a bewildering time of internal conflict. They were a revolving door for rulers with usurpations, abdications, murders, and incarcerations. There were 8 rulers between 1417 and the beginning of 1464 with 15 separate reigns. Usurpation was the order of the day. One ruler, Muhammad IX, possessing a certain persistence, enjoyed 4 separate reigns." End quote. Things got so bad that at one point the powerful and aristocratic family, the Banu Sarraj, also known as the Ibn Sarraje, attempted to slowly subvert the government and come to power themselves. Now, according to legend, again records were not exactly accurate, the Nasrid emir at the time, Abu Nasr Said, decided to finally deal with them. In 1462, he threw a major banquet for the Ibn Sarraje family in the Alhambra. In fact, the hall where this banquet allegedly was held now bears their name. The Sultan decided to serve a light salad with some croutons, a fine entree, and a dessert that didn't have too many calories. After all, you gotta watch those calories. However, just as the meal was coming to an end, he ordered his soldiers to storm into the room, had all the doors to the chamber slammed shut, and then proceeded to give the command to have nearly the entire family executed, basically where they sat. And this is how it was. Blood would flow in the swan-song years of the Nasrid as those that remained fought viciously to stay in power. Now, surprisingly, with so much internal disintegration, Granada continued to exist, or I should say, persist, albeit a shadow of her former self. But a big part of why Granada managed to survive this time period and avoid being completely wiped out had more to do with the fortunes of Castile. Castile had a difficult time after Henry II came to power and established the dynasty of the Trastamaras. The transition was a period of instability which was made worse by the fact that the first several kings of this new dynasty did not stay in power for very long. As a result, the need to complete the Reconquista was essentially put on the back burner, but that doesn't imply that this was a time of peace. By the early 15th century, in the wake of Muhammad V's death, The relationship between Castile and Granada would degrade. Hostility and open warfare would begin again and again between the two as treaties were established and then promptly broken. It was as Professor Catlos would describe as a hot peace. He explains it as such, quote, "The 15th century was for the most part an era of small-scale raiding rather than campaigns of conquest. Raids were usually undertaken as independent initiatives by Christian and Muslim border lords, sometimes in breach of established treaties. At other times, common folk struck out a mere opportunity, waylaying merchants, capturing herdsmen, and rustling livestock. However, the various kingdoms went to great lengths to prevent this sort of illegal activity, especially the kind that might damage the flow of trade, disrupt the transit of herds who pastured on both sides of the frontier, spark violent reprisals, or justify the annulment of a truce." End quote. This is not to say that Castile was entirely weak or could no longer go on the offensive. During the reign of John II, who came to power in 1406 when he was just a year old, and lasted until 1454, Castile would become a forerunner in the use of artillery, which he would use to devastating effect. It should be pointed out that many of the defensive positions in the emirate that were previously impregnable were now no longer capable of holding out in the face of Castilian firepower. For example, in the year 1410, the city of Antequera and the rich farmland it owned was taken by force for good. This would turn out to be a severe blow for Granada's economy, and in the subsequent decades, several other border cities would also exchange hands. But despite these advances, the Castilian rulers seemed to lack the nerve for a full-blown invasion. Indeed, when Castilian forces would invade deeper into Granada, they'd be pushed back or destroyed entirely. Granada, wrecked as it was internally, still had the capacity to hold her own. Granada and Castile were entering into very uncertain times. Again, very little is known about Granada, but in Castile we have a much better idea of what happened. When John II died in 1454, Castile would descend into a very tumultuous time. Henry IV would come to power, who initially thought of himself as being this great crusader king. However, in reality, he would prove to be both weak and indecisive on the offensive against the emirate. And if you were to ask the question, well, just how bad was he? Well, in time, he was given the title the Impotent, and this didn't have to do with just his poor military prowess. It was rumored that he not only lacked the ability to sire a child, but that his daughter and heir were not really his. As a result, his nobility rose up against him, proclaimed his brother Alfonso, the Prince of Asturias, as heir, and civil war broke out once again as Castile spun into another succession crisis. The once mighty kingdom now began to collapse into a very dark time. The conquest of the Kingdom of Granada would be deferred once again. It would seem that Castile would just never have the right kind of king to complete the Reconquista. The emirate, wrecked internally as it was, would still continue to exist. And taking that line from the Nazgul King from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, Granada could stare down the kings of Castile and say, "You fool, no man can kill me." And you have to admit the track record spoke for itself. Ferdinand III, who was arguably one of the greatest warrior kings, was able to take Cordoba and Seville, but then decided to keep the emirate around for the vast tribute. His son, Alfonso X, was too distracted trying to become the Holy Roman Emperor. Alfonso XI would come within an inch of finishing the Reconquista, but then was wiped out by the Black Death. Peter I just happened to like Granada too much and even put Muhammad V, who would rule during the Golden Age, back into power. And other kings would be born too young, die off too quickly, or like with Henry IV, would just not have the military stamina. But all of this would change on Henry IV's death in 1474. A new sovereign would come to power and would do what all the prior Castilian kings could not. In less than 20 years, Granada would finally crumble and fall. Al-Andalus, which had been around for over 800 years, would cease to exist. And the Reconquista would be decisively completed after an intense and bloody struggle. But that statement of the Nazgul king, "You fool, no man can kill me," would still hold true, because this new Castilian ruler wasn't a man, but a woman. And her name, in case you're wondering, was Isabella.